Good evening. This is the Caldwell report, and tonight we're tracking a major shift in federal immigration enforcement that is unfolding largely out of the public spotlight. In recent weeks, Immigration and Customs Enforcement, better known as ICE, has begun expanding operations nationwide, backed by a significant increase in detention capacity and federal funding. According to reporting from multiple outlets, ICE is moving forward with plans to add 92,600 new detention beds, part of a broader $38.3 billion expansion tied to enforcement and removal operations. Now, here's why this matters. On the surface, officials describe this as a logistical adjustment, preparing for increased enforcement demands, managing backlogs, and responding to existing legal mandates. But when you look closely at the scale, the timing, and the language being used, it raises a deeper set of questions about how far this expansion goes, who authorized it, and what the public has not been clearly told. What is confirmed is this: ICE has requested and received authorization to dramatically increase detention capacity, signaling a sharp operational shift compared to prior years. These are not temporary facilities. These are long-term investments in enforcement infrastructure. What remains unclear is how this expansion will be applied on the ground. Federal agencies have not provided detailed public briefings on targeting priorities, geographic concentration, or oversight mechanisms tied to the expansion, and that silence is what's drawing attention. Supporters argue this is about restoring order and enforcing existing law. Critics warn it could lead to broader enforcement sweeps with limited transparency. At this point, both claims exist, but only one side has concrete numbers attached to it. In the next 60 seconds, I'm going to walk you through exactly what's confirmed, what's being claimed, and the one detail most coverage is skipping that changes how this unfolds. Stay with me, because once you see how these pieces connect, the entire situation looks very different. This isn't about rhetoric, it's about power, process, and public accountability, and whether Americans are being fully informed about one of the largest immigration enforcement expansions in recent history. When officials say ICE operations are expanding, they're not talking about a single policy memo or a short-term surge. They're talking about capacity, contracts, and infrastructure, the things that lock policy in place long after headlines fade. Start with detention capacity. Federal documents show plans to scale up to tens of thousands of additional detention beds, many tied to multi-year private contracts. That matters because once beds exist, agencies are incentivized to use them. Capacity doesn't sit idle in Washington. Next, look at operational posture. Expansion isn't limited to border regions. Resources are being distributed across interior field offices, transportation units, and processing centers. That signals preparation for broader enforcement activity, not just case-by-case removals. Then there's the legal backdrop. Courts have mandated action on backlogs and removals in certain categories. ICE officials argue they're responding to those mandates. Critics counter that the scale goes well beyond compliance and into proactive enforcement. Both claims hinge on the same fact: expanded capability changes behavior. Oversight is the missing piece. While funding and contracts are public, detailed guidance on targeting, safeguards, and review mechanisms has been limited. Congressional committees have asked for briefings. Responses have been technical and narrow. That gap fuels concern, not because expansion is inherently unlawful, but because process without transparency invites distrust. What's important here is restraint. No mass sweeps have been announced. No new rules have been formally published. But the groundwork is being laid quietly, through procurement and logistics rather than press conferences. That's why this moment matters. Policy rarely turns on a single declaration. It turns on capacity built quietly, then activated when conditions allow. And that brings us to why this expansion is happening now, and why Washington is watching closely. ICE expansions don't happen in a vacuum, and they don't happen randomly. The timing tells you almost as much as the policy itself. First, there's legal pressure. Federal courts have increasingly pushed agencies to process backlogs, enforce standing removal orders, and comply with statutory mandates that had been deprioritized in recent years. That creates a compliance problem. You can't execute court-backed enforcement without capacity. Expanding detention and transport infrastructure is the fastest way to solve that. Second, there's political insulation. Building capacity quietly, through contracts and budget line items rather than headline announcements, allows agencies to prepare without triggering immediate backlash. It's a classic Washington move. Act administratively now, explain publicly later. Third, there's anticipation of volatility. DHS planners operate months ahead. They model election cycles, court rulings, and potential policy reversals. An expansion now positions ICE to respond quickly if enforcement priorities change, regardless of which direction they move. Fourth, there's resource reality. Once Congress allocates funding, agencies are expected to execute. Unused appropriations invite scrutiny. Expanding infrastructure demonstrates compliance with congressional intent, even if policy guidance remains flexible. What's notable is what hasn't happened. There has been no single speech announcing a major enforcement shift, no sweeping executive order, no public timeline outlining next steps. Instead, expansion is occurring through procurement, staffing, and logistics, the quiet architecture of policy. That's why Washington is paying attention. Quiet expansions often precede louder decisions. And once infrastructure is in place, policy options narrow. The key takeaway here is intent through preparation. ICE is not announcing mass action, but it is making itself capable of it. That distinction matters. As this expansion continues, the most important signals won't come from political speeches or press releases. They'll come from operational behavior. First, watch field activity. Changes in how frequently enforcement actions occur, where they're concentrated, and which categories are prioritized will reveal how expanded capacity is actually being used. Infrastructure exists for a reason, and patterns emerge quickly once it's activated. Second, watch interagency coordination. When U.S. Immigration and Customs Enforcement increases capacity, it rarely acts alone. Cooperation with DHS components, local authorities, and federal courts often increases quietly before it becomes visible to the public. Third, watch congressional response. Hearings, funding riders, or oversight demands are often delayed reactions to administrative action. If lawmakers begin pressing for explanations or guardrails, it's a sign that expansion has crossed from preparation into execution. Fourth, watch legal challenges. Expanded enforcement capacity tends to trigger litigation. Court filings, injunction requests, or emergency motions can surface early indicators of how far operations are pushing existing boundaries. Finally, watch language shifts. When officials move from neutral phrasing to more directive language, prioritizing, accelerating, scaling, that's a clue that policy posture is firming up. None of these signals alone define the outcome. Together, they tell you whether this expansion remains latent or becomes active enforcement. The broader point is this: policy rarely turns on one announcement. It turns on capacity plus timing, and both are now in place. As we close, here's the reality. This expansion is real, it's measurable, and it's happening quietly. No mass operations have been formally announced. No sweeping policy reversal has been declared. But infrastructure doesn't build itself, and it doesn't exist without purpose. Expanded capacity changes what is possible and what becomes likely when conditions shift. That's why this moment matters. For supporters, expanded enforcement represents preparedness and compliance with existing law. For critics, it raises questions about transparency, oversight, and civil liberties. Those debates will intensify once capacity turns into action. What comes next won't be decided by rhetoric. It will be decided by how capacity is used, who sets priorities, and how much sunlight is applied to the process. This is not a headline-driven story. It's a structural one. This is the Caldwell report. We track preparation before policy. We watch capacity before action. And we follow the story where it actually unfolds, inside the process. If you want continued fact-driven coverage as this develops, like this video, subscribe, and turn notifications on. When quiet preparation becomes visible action, we'll break it down clearly and responsibly. We'll stay on it.